Hello. In episode 29.2 of Heirs for Architecture, Gary Boyd, Professor of Architecture at Queen's University, Belfast, speaks about his book, Architecture and the Face of Coal, Mining and Modern Britain, published by Lund Humphreys in December 2022.
This pivotal position meant that miners were treated seriously because all industry was completely kind of influenced by mining or completely dependent upon mining. So mining became this thing. So they had this leverage, and this leverage meant obviously that they demanded at times bigger wages and things, but it also meant they became recipients, sometimes after actively canvassing for it, but they became recipients of goods and services, especially services to do with their lifestyle. And that includes ideas of hygiene, ideas ultimately of housing, and also cultural and social pursuits. So this generates a series of architectural interventions.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Gary Boyd. Gary, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Gary Boyd. I'm a Professor of Architecture at Queen's University, Belfast.
That's it? Are you an architect as well?
I trained as an architect initially and then kind of swayed into academia in my late 20s, where I've been there ever since. But I do practice a bit with my wife, who has her own firm, and I have been involved in numerous things like curating exhibitions and doing bits and pieces of building work as well. So I like to think I kind of practice in a broad way, from ideas of actual buildings to notions of writing.
Yeah. And you trained in Scotland or you trained in Ireland?
I trained in Scotland initially. I went to Strathclyde for my undergraduate and my master's, and then I was actually working in Edinburgh. And I got just about my part threes, and I got the offer to do a PhD in Dublin. So I won a scholarship to do a PhD in Dublin. And on the same week, I was offered a job in Edinburgh, and I had to make this kind of big life choice. So I ended up going to Dublin, and the rest is history. Well, it has been history, because that's what I do now, is history.
Oh, yeah, it's fantastic. And what was it? I mean, so we're talking today about your book, Architecture in the Face of Coal, Mining and Modern Britain, published by Lund Humphreys, which was published this year or the end of last year?
It was, I don't know, there's two dates. One was December 22 and the other was January 23. I'm going to call it January 23 for the sake of it.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating book, beautifully published, as one would expect from Lund Humphreys, with some beautiful imagery. But yeah, I wondered whether you'd be able to kind of explain what motivated the book. Where does it come from? Does it come from like a kind of a heritage of this kind of research in your work around modernism and modernist industrial infrastructures, or is there something else?
I think there's a whole confluence of things, actually, because it's quite personal as well, because I grew Falkirk, where I grew up, is an ex-mining town, or an ex-steel town. Mm-hmm. So Carron Ironworks is in the vicinity, and there was lots of mining throughout decades and decades and hundreds of years, actually. So when I was a formative age, the miners' strike was going on, so everybody was talking about Kinneil Colliery, which is nearby to me, and also Paul Kemet Colliery, which isn't far away in the central belt of Scotland. And then actually, not far from where I grew up, where I used to go walking with my dad and my uncle, there was the remnants of an old colliery, and they used to talk about it. And I was fascinated by this series of ruins, including a set of staircases, which went to nowhere. And I asked my uncle, where did those staircases go? And he said they went to the Pithead Baths. And I went, oh. And this was, kind of news to me. I can't remember at what stage he told me this, but I was fascinated by this area, this site. And then the book kind of grew out of that. I used to take, when I was in my first year, I used to take the train from the first year at college, my undergraduate. I used to take the train from Falkirk to Glasgow, and just in a place called Dullator, there was an amazing building which was flat roofed, all these planar elements, amazing kind of ironwork details that you get a glimpse of as you sped past. And I presumed, since it was in the middle of nowhere, that it was a dairy or something to do with like farming, but subsequently I found out it was Pithead Baths. So I applied for a Leverhulme major research scholarship because I realized there was a kind of lacuna in thinking of this incredibly important series of buildings that had been made around the coal industry that had emerged throughout the 20th century and had been incredibly progressive socially in what is otherwise obviously a deleterious industry. So I began to become really fascinated by that. I began to read around it, and then I made an application, and the application was accepted, and I got the opportunity to take some time out from Queen's University to write the book, which I did.
Brilliant. It's a really nice story about sort of the why of it. And I think that I was going to ask you, you casually use this phrase Pithead Baths as if somehow anybody would know what you were talking about. But it's obviously explained in the book, but and we'll come to that. But it's a really interesting idea that you deal with in the book, which is that something that perhaps in the popular imagination is characterized as a piece of infrastructure, which is energy production, energy sourcing and production, has in fact got this architectural component to it. And as you say, has a very kind of progressive idea underpinning it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that idea.
Yeah, I mean, we forget, don't we? Because we tend to look at mining in Britain through the lens of the miners' strike. So that's kind of how we see it. And there's this kind of separation, this big schism in history, which caused a big schism in terms of social attitudes towards the strikers. But what we tend to forget was that mining was hugely labor intensive. So there was a body of workers which in 1913 was over 1 million. There was over 1 million workers mine workers in Great Britain working at a series of, thousands of pits. And so that is, with their dependents, if you like, that's probably about 5 million people directly connected with mine working, which is about 1/10 of the population, which is incredible. And that 1/10 of the population, well, put it this way, the rest of the population was entirely dependent on that section of the working class for fuel, for life, for everything. So miners were absolutely pivotal to the way that the industry or industrial Britain actually operated. So everybody was kind of, George Orwell described them as and using a very nice architectural terminology, he described the miner as the grimy caryatid upon which everything that is not grimy is supported. So suddenly you realize this pivotal position meant that miners were treated seriously because all industry was completely kind of influenced by mining or completely dependent upon mining. So mining became this thing. So they had this leverage. And this leverage meant obviously that they kind of demanded at times bigger wages and things, but it also meant they became recipients, sometimes after actively canvassing for it, but they became recipients of goods and services, especially services to do with their lifestyle. And that includes ideas of hygiene, ideas ultimately of housing, and also cultural and social pursuits. So this generates a series of architectural interventions. And the most conspicuous ones of these in the 1920s and 1930s were these buildings that I talked about earlier, this typology called the Pithead Baths. And the Pithead Bath movement, if you like, emerged from actually looking at foreign precedents. So there's a series of governmental acts, etc., and governmental inquiries to look at the kind of position of miners' hygiene. A series of people went over to look at how it was dealt with in Europe, in France, in Belgium, and Germany, the kind of competitive mining countries, and it became this. Eventually became this idea that miners should wash at their place of work, which was beneficial for all sorts of reasons, including and especially, I argue in the book, for the women folk or the domestic workers of the coalfields whose house had frequently been kind of, well, look at it this way. If a miner was working kind of 8 or 10 hours a day, a miner's spouse was working far longer than this, because most mining households had sons and fathers who were coming home and expected to be bathed at home. And this is the kind of archetypical image of the tin bath in front of the fireplace, etc., and the soot and the dirt and everything that came with that. So what arises, and yeah, I will probably come to this a little bit later on, is a kind of pressure builds up for the development of this new typology. And what happens in Britain is it takes on a very conspicuous series of architectural forms and aesthetics.
I see. I have my great grandfather mined in Shirebrook, and you actually have a picture of a drawing of the Shirebrook colliery baths. And this is the first picture I've seen of it, because the story that's recounted to me, because my father was, what do you call it, taken out of London during the Blitz, and he went to stay up with my grandparents in Shirebrook in Derbyshire. And he recalls his grandfather coming home and being washed down in the yard by his wife, like giving him a brooming down and a hosing like a beast of burden. But I don't know whether that was just a romantic kind of fabrication, because a lot of people do that, particularly people from I don't know. It seems a better image than saying that they had these extraordinary and rather elegant kind of buildings, because that's the other thing about it, isn't it? It's not just that the social program that is connected to this idea of the cleaning, the workers getting clean on site, but the architecture itself sort of takes on a progressive and modern language.
It does. I mean, at various times you had issues with getting people into the industry, actually, and so they try to make it as attractive as possible through different kind of mechanisms, and the pithead baths is one of that. But despite that, I mean, actually, I should say that the pithead baths program was quite often controversial. Miners sometimes didn't want it. Women tended to want it. Women of the coalfields tended to want it for obvious reasons. The unions were for it. There was a whole series of campaigners who kind of made efforts to get this thing realized. There was an amazing woman called Mary Glazier who had this vision, and this begins to kind of describe an idea of the architecture. She had this vision. She wrote a book in 1912, and she had this idea that the pithead baths would rise from every colliery like a shining white temple. Which is a really kind of interesting, conspicuous phrase to be saying in 1912. White, for example. Well, that's really interesting in the context of a coal mine, and this is kind of pre-international style modernism, so it's kind of they are thinking about this kind of notion of something which almost supersedes cleanliness or supersedes soot to create cleanliness. So that's going on, and one of the things, there was also a book written by people called Chappell and Fraser, who described the buildings themselves as being potentially pithead baths, which were nascent at the time in the early 1920s. He suggested that these baths could be acts of propaganda. Now, first of all, the baths were considered by the government and other agencies as technical things, just for the sheer kind of, or mere rather, washing of the men. But gradually there was a kind of idea that they should be kind of magnificent as well. So they became something which superseded their functional necessity, despite the fact they are incredibly honed. The interiors, how the interiors work, how the kind of functioning works of the building itself. It's kind of like Fordism, how you get 1,000 miners to be washed every kind of shift, every 7 hours through this thing, and have the water all ready for them, etc. It's an incredible thing, which involves a kind of spatial planning, a kind of planning of logistics, etc. And 1,000 miners on a shift wasn't unusual. Some collieries had up to 3,000 miners or more. So it's a hugely logistic thing. So they developed a system. How they did this, they separated the dirty, the pit side from the clean side, if you like. So when you came in from your pit, there's 2 lockers. Everything was duplicated, if you like. So when you came in from the pit, from your shift, you got undressed and you put your dirty clothes in a pit locker, and then you passed through a filter of showers, washed yourself, and went into another locker and picked up your home clothes, and then left through a different entrance from the one you just arrived in from the pit side. So it was incredibly kind of streamlined mechanistic system inside, and this system was replicated in every pithead baths. I should say that the pithead baths were built by the Miners' Welfare Committee architecture.
I was going to come on to that, because I think it's very difficult for people who don't understand what British mining was to understand how this comes about, and I think that's a really important part of the story, isn't it? That this is a nationalized industry.
Yeah.
That mining is a nationalized industry, and it has deep roots into Britain's kind of imperial kind of identity and functioning. It sells coal all over its empire. But there's this other thing that you've alluded to already, which I think for me was just like a very poetic, very, very insightful, which is this idea of the presence of the miner in every home, in every life. Like every fire you lit in your house to keep your body warm, to keep your baby's body warm, to warm up your water, came from these working class men and these working class communities. And so, and that sense of this absolute integration of an industry like energy production, like coal mining, and the national good, and therefore its nationalization or its national ownership, is like really important. So the pithead baths come from nationalized ideas.
Somewhat.
Okay.
Somewhat. The pithead baths begins in there's 2 major pieces of legislation, 2 major parliamentary commissions, actually, rather, the Sankey Commission and the Samuel Commission, and they are, the first one, the Sankey Commission, is in 1922, and the Samuel Commission is 1926. 1926 should, ring alarm bells. It was the year of the general strike, and the Samuel Commission is set up around that context. But these are, this is in the era pre-nationalisation, but there was still, but what you say is not completely untrue, because what happens is a recognition of the state of mining labour, what it has to deal with on a daily basis, and so forth. There's kind of, within the Samuel Commission and the Sankey Commission, there's kind of there's representations from a whole series of different people about aspects of poverty and problems within these places. So what happens is they produce the Miners' Welfare Committee. It's set up in the wake of the first commission, the Sankey Commission. And the Miners' Welfare Commission does lots of stuff to do with rehabilitation centres, to do with sports facilities, to do with all this kind of stuff surrounding mining, and begins to think a little bit about pithead baths. And the pithead baths thing grows and grows and grows. And then after the Samuel Commission really takes off, But what happens is the Miners' Welfare Committee is funded by a levy placed on coal. So it's funded by taxation, which means there's a redistribution of wealth from the coal owners and those who own the mines towards the people who are going to be working within those mines. But also the people who are working there, the miners themselves, also contributed towards it. And it was, so basically the Miners' Welfare Committee was something which owed an allegiance to, on the committee, for example, in terms of personnel, there's people there from the unions, there's people there from coal owners, and there was people there from the government. So it's a kind of state, worker, and ownership capitalist kind of body which works together to administer this fund, which then is produced to make inroads into miners' welfare on a series of different things. So in other words, and those things are buildings, and those things are pieces of architecture, and those things are about, obviously, welfare. So my argument in the book is this makes a prototypical version of the welfare state that after 1945, etc., will be extended to all the other workers within the United Kingdom. Yeah, but nationalisation itself didn't actually happen within the coal mining industry until 1947. But it was the first nationalised industry, which again says a lot about the importance with which it was considered, the critical, pivotal importance that it had within the UK society.
So how did, that's wonderful. How did this, because what I see when I look through some of the images and your descriptions of some of the images of, for example, the coal head baths, there is a kind of, not a uniformity certainly, but there is a kind of coherence to the architectural languages and the spatial planning of these things. Is this, as you suggested, simply Fordism? This is like utilitarianist design. This is the best way you can shift 1,000 dirty men through a facility. Or is there something, and you've also alluded earlier in our conversation to kind of the influences of the continent and an international idea around this. Is there something there that's starting to inform this? Is there examples that they're drawing on that? Because you could understand if it was a nationalized industry and the government said, like I've worked on school designs before, and you know that there's not actually that much you can do. But this is not that. This is something kind of.
No, they're amazingly celebratory buildings. They're fantastic. They're the most conspicuous, or they were the most conspicuous buildings in any mining neighborhood, really, because they look incredibly civic. But as I said before, the interior works in a very it does work in a mechanistic way, but it's incredibly well designed. So you'd find the same components in every pithead baths. And we had pithead baths in Sutherland at the top of Scotland. We had pithead baths in Kent, not far from where you're sitting right now. You'd find the same components in the inside, but in the outside, there was a kind of series of architectural languages which were adopted and developed. And they had, I mean, I argue in the book, well, obviously, first of all, they are incredibly influenced by the architecture of Wilhelm Marinus Dudok, and arguably, especially this Hilversum Town Hall. But within that, also the schools, which you find mostly in Hilversum, also. And I've kind of argued in the book that this was somewhat related to Dutch Expressionism. And from that, German Expressionism and the idea purported by Bruno Taut of the Stadtkrone, the city crown, this kind of idea of a building which is culturally very significant and is at the same time civilizing, you know, and people can kind of engage with that. In their case, it's like the development of a secular cathedral, which is the center of every town. And you can see that very, very clearly if you go to Hilversum and look at the town hall, because it's massive. It's massive. It's far bigger and more elaborate and more beautiful than it needs to be for what is, you know, still a very small provincial town. But some of that essence gets carried into this notion of the pithead baths. So in the inside, they kind of work very kind of mechanistic. Well, they don't work mechanistically because they're incredibly well designed, and they're incredibly kind of accommodating and comfortable,
Mhm.
you know, and but on the outside they take on the civic language, which is somewhat derived from Dudok, and then kind of, especially schools, and then kind of, you know, manipulated. There's a series of kind of typologies of plan type that are used, like L shapes and Z shapes and stuff like that, which are then become kind of, or you can stack them. So there's infinite variety within these typological kind of reductions, but at the same time, on the outside, there's a kind of very, expensive solution to these things, you know, because it's about celebrating the miners, and it's about kind of convincing the miners that this is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, they all have a tower, and I was looking at them thinking, rather fabulous. So it's got this kind of, and I'm guessing that's where the water tank sat, because if you're washing 1,000 men, you've got to have a hell of a lot of water up there. They must all have a massive boiler room because they're not washing in cold water.
That's right.
And they're all built, as far as I can see, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they're all built in this kind of brick with these horizontal planes. So it's a very early modernist language, as you say, from Dudok, but also, I mean, so between these two acts you were talking about, the Sankey report and the Samuel report, is that right?
That's right.
You've got Verzun architecture comes out, so obviously that's in the atmosphere as well. There's kind of embracing of the languages of transportation of the sea liner and all of those kind of usual stories. But there's also something quite vernacular about them. They're built out of bricks, and they look kind of, it's like supersized common man architecture. It's quite an
it's interesting that they're all. I mean, arguably I mean, it's been argued by people like Beatrice Colomina very convincingly that modernism is about, or white box modernism, if you like, white planar modernism. It's about the pursuit of hygiene and health and defeating tuberculosis. And what's quite interesting about the pithead baths is they're completely about hygiene, but they do it through a medium which isn't white. Although I will add a caveat, because if you go to, because what's interesting is it's a national body, right? So they all work out of a single office in London under this man called John Henry Forshaw, who I think is a much overlooked key practitioner within 20th century British architecture for many reasons, not just the Miners' Welfare Committee. So they're all working there, but they're working in regional teams. And what happens is that there's a kind of identity that's allowed across. So there's a uniformity in terms of how the interior operates, but in terms of the external expression, there are differences, and you can see the differences. And what also is really interesting is that Forshaw established a really amazing team of very, very young architects. And mostly male. I think there's one or two females noted in the archives, but mostly male. Kind of understandably, maybe at the time there wasn't that many female architects, but they have enormous responsibility, and they have an enormous opportunity to produce and express architecture. So it's difficult to say exactly how many pithead baths were actually made, but it's somewhere between 600 and 800. I wish I could be a little bit more specific than that.
In how long a period?
Sorry, from about 1920 to 1922 until they were still making them in the 1950s. The last ones kind of stop in about the 1950s, where they kind of have complete saturation. And the pithead baths were accommodating about 600,000 workers on a daily basis, you know, probably during the 1930s. So there's loads and loads of these buildings, or I should say there were loads and loads of these buildings.
Yeah, I wanted to come to that at the end, actually. I mean, it's the place you start the book, and it's the place I think that it would be nice to head towards, which is the kind of issue around erasure of this particular epoch, architectural epoch and cultural epoch. And it's that epoch that I'm really... I was looking at a little map. I was reading your book, and I looked up a map because I hadn't realized until quite recently that Britain exported a lot of its coal as well. And this was one of our devices of imperial growth. And for some reason, I'd never really thought about empire as being the production of a marketplace as much as it is a production of a resource dump. Resource, a space of exploitation. It's a space of sales. And there's this great map, which is from the early 20th century, of these arrows heading out from Britain. And most of our coal is going to the continent.
Yeah.
Very little going to Australia, quite a lot going to far East Asia, but some even going up towards, Chile and Mexico on the eastern seaboard and so on. Amazing. And I was wondering whether there was something in that flow of information, not just in the architectural languages, as you've mentioned, Dudok and Tautend, in terms of the perhaps the aesthetic and formal inspirations, but also in the social forms that are then embodied. So this issue of architecture as a social generator, and was there a flow of kind of emancipatory logics, say, for example, coming back to Britain via the coal mines in a way, like unions, workers' associations, rights for women, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I'm not sure about coming back, or maybe I kind of argue they flowed from the way the coal mining industry became organized, from agitation from within, with this understanding that really the miner held the keys to the nation, and had to be listened to, and obviously this became, as we progressed through the 20th century, this became a threat, and this is perceived more and more as a threat. So now, there's the kind of movement towards oil and gas, which is very, very small workforces and usually offshore. And the other thing is you have no vision, there's no visibility of who's making your energy, which is kind of really interesting, So I mean, that's happening. That happens eventually, and you have this kind of idea of a kind of idea of production being removed from the locality. Some miners begin to disappear from our everyday experience, but they're replaced by miners as being sources of controversy. Now, controversies goes through mining from the very, very beginning, but arguably becomes in the 1970s and the 1980s this thing which is kind of, increased and becomes, as I said, very, very divisive. Mm-hmm. But if we can skip back a couple of decades to look at 1951, for example, coal is nationalized in 1947 and becomes the poster child for the welfare state and indeed for the processes of nationalization. So it's given a huge amount of publicity. It's celebrated everywhere. So if you kind of wandered into the Festival of Britain, for example, in 1951, you would have found a coal pavilion. You'd have found a coal pavilion in the Glasgow Empire exhibition in 1938. You'd have found a coal pavilion elsewhere in other previous exhibitions. So it's talked about and, it's discussed. There was an amazing... In the late 40s, there was an amazing exhibition called The Miner Comes to Town, which was designed by the Centre of Information, which had been involved in wartime propaganda. And it looked about, it was about celebrating or revealing the hidden influence of coal mining products within everyday life in Britain and elsewhere. So, for example, they talked about things like ladies' stockings, toilet paper, numerous things, chemicals, etc., etc. So, there is a sense that this is about this. There's a sense that this is about. It's about an indication of modernity, a representation of modernity, a representation of modern Britain within a kind of imperial setting. I guess it becomes part of that world. And I suppose as a result of that, the miner and the position of the miner is kind of celebrated more and more. So labour becomes acknowledged and valued within these moments. In a very mainstream way. It wasn't peripheral. It was kind of central to these. We had, for example, in Hyde Park, you had, during the Miner Comes to Town exhibition, you have a grandstand, or rather a bandstand, made to look like the headgear from a colliery, and a whole series of miners' bands, invited to play there at certain times during the day to a kind of audience of kind of metropolitan Londoners, who all had no direct experience of coal mining communities, but all of whom used coal on a daily basis.
Sort of that permeation into everyday life, I think, is really, really, really interesting. Was that connection seen as being I'm kind of interested to go back a little bit to think about this emergence of a narrative of the need of miners and mining communities for better representation within political discussions, and the effect that then has. So obviously it has this effect around pithead bathing. Are there other aspects of mine architecture, not just mine communities? I think we can come on to that, but that were also kind of starting to be influenced in this way. So and how did these come about? Who was leading the charge again? Was it this conglomeration between these, the government, the unions? And I'm kind of really interested when you mentioned unions, but pre-nationalization, I wondered what that might even looked like. Like, who the hell were these people? This is kind of amazing idea for pre-nationalized. You struggle to get Amazon workers don't get to have a union anymore. So anyway, I'm just kind of interested in that progressive kind of political thing and how it was organized and where else it might have been seen.
Yeah, I think, the unions, I'm being quite simplistic about it, because there was always more than one union. There wasn't a national union of mine workers until 1945, I think. So prior to that, there was kind of, one of the things that they wanted to get was national representation, which happens then. So prior to that, they're kind of involved in all sorts of things, and again through striking and through taking very direct action. We've got to remember that the Labour Party government, which was elected in 1945, had former miners within it, which is quite interesting. And they had an agenda, along with the mine workers themselves. They had an agenda for nationalisation for some decades, actually. But this wasn't just coming from the mine. What happened was, funnily enough, the mining industry in Britain was quite old-fashioned, because it hadn't really developed mechanistically since the 19th century. So when you're having all these things happening within these amazingly new kind of machine-like pithead baths, what's actually happening underground is the extraction of coal using decades, centuries-old technology, actually. So it never really kind of, because of the vested interests of the coal owners and the money necessary to develop new things, it wasn't done, because they just kind of hopped. So the whole industry was just hopping along in a really precarious state until 1947, and the idea that they would make a new industry which would shift towards intense mechanization. I should say that, like, for example, if you want to say I wanted, and I know this is controversial in the context of Cumbria, and that kind of ridiculous idea to allow a new mine to be made. But if you wanted to make a mine in the morning, it's about 20 years before you can expect any coal. That's how long it takes to make a mine, or certainly did. Maybe it's quicker now, 15 to 20 years. And it's risky. So that, so you need a kind of nationalized unit to take those risks, to ensure the flow of coal. So what happens is there's a report, a technical report, which became known as the Reid Report, which was published, I think, during the war, which was suggesting a new way in which the coal industry should be organized, from how it could be kind of socially organized, but more about how it could be technologically organized to embrace mechanization and what that might mean. And there's also this idea within that there would be a new miner. The miner would not be the apprentice laborer and the hewer of kind of coal with his hands, but would be a kind of technician and an overseer of mechanization machines and so forth. So that's happening. And this is Britain trying to play catch up to what's already occurred in Germany, and actually Holland, funnily enough, and Belgium and France, and America. So it's trying to play catch up to hold on to these imperial markets that you're talking about, because after the war, Germany is actually kind of producing more coal than Britain, and it's producing, so there's these things that are happening that are eroding Britain's kind of place within the world. So you have an idea of mechanization, and this new social and technological industry required an infrastructure. So they decided they would remodel existing pits. So they surveyed all the pits. They closed down a lot of pits, because coal is always about obsolescence. They closed down a load of pits and they remodeled ones that they thought had a future. And then they commissioned a series of new pits, which were known as super pits, which were kind of ad initio, incredibly mechanized, incredibly streamlined, all this kind of Fordist kind of time and motion scientific management stuff was going to go on underground and on the surface. So you get this integrated kind of system which would operate across these two things. So in Scotland, there was the development of a very nice series of I use that word advisedly, but a very kind of interesting series of kind of brutalist buildings made by a guy called Egon Rees. And Egon Rees became the chief architect for the National Coal Board in Scotland, but he had been educated in the Bauhaus and had lived for a while in Isaac Flats, etc. And he designed the amazing donkey bookcase that some of you may know of. So he built a series of amazing pits within Scotland, and one of which was Rothes, which was the first super pit to be made in Scotland, opened by Her Majesty the Queen in the 1960s sometime. So this is happening, and as part of this world, part of this new reconstruction of the coal mining industry, there was a reconstruction of coal mining societies, which meant a lot of immigration across from depleted areas of coal production to new areas of coal production, and the generation of a series of measures whereby they would be accommodated. So, for example, Rothes becomes the generator of Glenrothes. So the Scottish new town of Glenrothes is completely dependent on this new colliery, this super pit. And the two things, I argue in the book, have similarities in thinking about the flow of goods and materials and people across either underground within the pit and on the surface of the pit, but also within the way that Glenrothes new town was designed in the wake of the Buchanan report about cars and about movement and stuff. So there's a really interesting synergy across those two things. It's especially clear in Glenrothes, but it's also there in Washington Newtown, in Peterlee, and elsewhere. So when you look at the Newtown kind of criteria, you can see that outside London and outside the new towns which were designed for London, that a lot of the other new towns have a relationship to coal. They're either on coal fields or they're on ex-coal fields, or they're, so there's some kind of interesting kind of relationship there, which actually relates back to other aspects of housing. For example, Raymond Unwin and the idea of some of the interwar housing, which was actually based. Raymond Unwin, obviously the kind of father of town planning, was a kind of coal mine engineer kind of person. He made houses for coal miners. He talked about coal mining. He talked about he writes very eloquently about going down in the Commonweal, on the same page as William Morris is talking about News from Nowhere. Raymond Unwin is talking about his experiences in the coal mine. These things are connected, I think, and Raymond Unwin knew this man, another very overlooked but arguably influential architect called Percy Houghton, who produced a cottage, which, again, I argue, maybe somewhat extending things, but I argue that becomes one of the models for for council housing within the interwar and post-war period.
It's, I like this idea as well, and I really like, so in your second section talking about this idea of settlement, the way that the mine, I think you've expressed it really well, that the kind of the pithead bath becomes a beacon which in a way operates to elevate, advertise Britain's identity as a kind of progressive, imperial, proud force, but underground you've got this kind of knot of ancient practices, which are really very, very unhappy. But then with the development of these things, you get the kind of the modernity of the new way of doing baths spills out into these settlements, and I think that's just a really fascinating idea. I was wondering whether there was anything in the book that was the old mining communities produced a certain cultural form, a certain form of working class communities, which, as you say, I mean, the brass band tradition in Britain, for example, is deeply embedded in. And a huge richness of cultural forms came from that period. And then we get this kind of emancipatory, or perhaps arguably paternalistic view of the miner and the needs of the mining community, and that produces something else. I mean, what does it produce? What is Glenrothes like? Is it in the end a sustainable community, or does it have all of those characteristics of top-down and applied logics, mechanistic thinking, utilitarian thinking, visible within it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot in what you say. I mean, first of all, I should have probably mentioned that kind of inevitably when you're working underground, it has to be about community. You're completely reliant on the people around you for safety. So mining communities were very well known for having a kind of belief systems which were slightly different from elsewhere. And that was quite often to do with a sense of comradeship, quite often a sense of left-wing leaning kind of attitudes towards things, to do with the kind of idea of community being very, very kind of sacrosanct and important. Quite often there was also kind of elsewhere in Europe, for example, there was veneration of religious iconography. There was other types of community thought of. There was notions of that. So, and then alongside that, you're right, there is a kind of paternal point of view as well, I think, and there is a tension there. You can see that, and for example, in the dukeries in Nottinghamshire, which also becomes this kind of notion of almost like a series of garden suburbs which were built for miners, but it's a very authoritarian regime which is operating, where the owner of the mine is also the owner of the housing schemes that you kind of rent from, so it has this complete control over you, and there was certainly prior to nationalisation, there was problems like that, and there was issues like that all over the country, where your employment was tied, if you like, to your housing. The thing about Glenrothes is interesting, because Rothes Colliery was a kind of economic disaster. As I said earlier on, when you build a colliery, especially a kind of super pit, the amount of money necessary is vast, the amount of time necessary is vast. And in fact, Rothes Colliery suffered from unfixable flooding. Okay. So it closed down quite quickly, I think within 10 years. I think it might have been closed since in 1962, and then wasn't pulled down until I think in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. But nicely, bits of it still remain. And on the other hand, the society, or the societal forms produced in Glenrothes have kind of proved completely adaptable. because Glenrothes is still quite a thriving community, which kind of embraced quite early on the new technologies of computers, etc. To and the idea of Silicon Glen in Scotland. So there is something kind of interesting about that. Now, I don't go into that too much in the book, but there is. There's a kind of idea. If you go to Glenrothes and you go around all these roundabouts, trying to find the colliery, which you can still find because bits of Egan Reese's building are still there, and quite a few of his buildings are still there in bits. Never the productive bits, but usually kind of parts of the administrative bits and stuff like that. You find, you eventually find this thing.
Yeah, I think.
But Glenrothes thrives.
Yeah, it does, and it's got some great buildings in it, and I think, however, there is this really interesting thing. So in the title of your book, you use the word representation. In the section which section is it? Why do I forget? Anyway, it's there is a section you write. Hold on, I can check. I can take this. I can take this rather clumsy segue out. This is the power in my hands, you see. I probably won't. Yeah, it's in section 1, you call the evolution of form and representation, the search for expression. So there's this idea that the country and the industry of coal, of energy, are absolutely integrated. Yeah. And it starts moving offshore and it starts moving away through gas and other forms. And now it's like this very abstract thing that like no one's quite sure how it happens. And at the same time, as it declines, there's this concerted effort of erasure.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting. This idea of going to Glenrothes, a town that comes from coal, and you struggle to find anything. And you see this over and over again. And I was wondering if you would want to talk, if you could talk about this idea of erasure and why this is a concept that you have at the very start of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's just, first of all, what's conspicuous is the vast network of things, visible things, architectural things, and infrastructures that were connected with coal. And then when you go to look for them, you can't find any of them. Well, you can find a few, but really, so I mean, I found myself. There's an amazing thing you can use. It's I think you get it through the National Library in Scotland, but you can probably get it elsewhere. The links to, you can kind of overlay ordnance maps with digital photographs from now. Yeah. So you begin to develop this sense, because you're looking for stuff through, obviously, from desk research. So you're looking for kind of something, and then if you find something significant, you might go there. And I found a series of a very small series of pithead baths around the place, but not many. There's not many left. But then you start to look from these aerial photographs and you see these kind of smudges of grey around about an area you think somewhere might be to do with collieries or coal mining. And then, so you can do this thing on this in the Ordnance Survey where you can flip between different layers of transparency. So you kind of flip it from that present day photograph to something from, say, 1950 or maybe 1840 or something, and this whole world emerges. You're looking at like kind of 18 railway sidings. You're looking at a coal washery which is vast. You're looking at car parks. Because a lot of it's recently gone. So you have car parks emerging on these. When you flip back to the ordnance map of what was there 50 years ago or 40 years ago, and you kind of go, oh my God, it's amazing. I remember being this. I can't remember. It might have been Leven in Fife and wandering around trying to look for the site of a pithead bath, and I think that's where Wesley Colliery was, which was one of the biggest in Scotland pre-nationalisation. And I was kind of wandering around, not seeing anything, finding in bits and pieces, fragments, thinking, look, there's a brick there. Do you think that brick was part of a pithead bath? I'm not really sure. And I remember going home and looking at it, and basically on this kind of notion of this Ordnance Survey thing, and finding out that the main street I'd walked down had been a railway. where they put the kind of railway from all the coal wagons had gone up the main street of this town, and all the cottages were kind of facing this kind of, every day there'd be kind of coal trains going by. It was part, it was that close to everybody's kind of daily life. And then, it's just so difficult to find any of it, So I think, it's because I've been working with a colleague of mine in Germany, a guy called Stefan Berger, and we've been having conversations about, because I gave some lectures in Germany, I think the year before last, and we've been talking about why this has happened, and why in Germany, if you go to Germany, you have a much bigger celebration of the figure of the miner in culture and history and the contributions you've made. So you have amazingly kind of well-funded museums and stuff. And it's kind of very obvious, isn't it? It's very deeply political in Britain. The figure of the miner is deeply political. There is it's part of, I hate to use the word, but it's kind of lazy of me to say this, but it's part of a culture war, whereby traces of working class history are erased, and they always are, and they kind of always have been. And this is what's interesting. If I can get back to Nicholas Pevsner for a minute, when Nicholas Pevsner's writing the Buildings of England, I think he's talking about Durham, but it might be Northumberland. And he's talking about, so this is in the 1950s, and he's talking about pithead baths, and he's already saying that many of them have gone. No, so the industry was always peripatetic. It always moved, and it was always to do with obsolescence. But what was really interesting in one of his publications, he has a manor house on the same page as a pithead bath, and he's giving equivalence to both of them. Yeah, he's talking about this is really important. This pithead bath built by Frederick Fritzl, who's an amazing architect, and the other one was. I can't remember who designed it, but it's in the book. So, but if you go there, the manor house will still be there.
Yeah.
The pithead baths are long gone. The manor house, which was occupied by one very, very wealthy person, will still be there. And the pithead bath, which is occupied by kind of thousands of miners on a daily basis, will be gone and not celebrated. So there's a kind of, and that's, we were surrounded by history. What's preserved rarefies certain kind of political attitudes, doesn't it? What's valued does that as well. And part of the book is kind of trying to redress that, I suppose, and tell this kind of slightly kind of poignant story about the disappearance and erasure of all these things. I actually think that, because I went to. Again, this comes out in the book. I went to Comrie, which was a model pit, which is an amazing kind of model pit, which is made just in Fife, in Dunfermline, not far from where I am. I was born and grew up in Falkirk, and I went there and I saw a couple of buildings, left, but at that time they were busy dismantling the spoil heaps. So there's massive big diggers taking the spoil heaps away, and you think that's fair enough, actually, because even the Miners' Welfare Committee in the 1930s and 1940s were operating a process of getting rid of spoil heaps because they're ugly and all the rest of it. But at the same time, you think, well, that spoil heap was testimony to something. It was testimony to labour. It was testimony to the people who went underground and took risks, and not just immediate physical risks, but long-term risks to do with, lung disease, eye disease, all the things that miners had, which were really problematic that the miners' welfare tried to do things about. It's testimony to their labour, and it's going, and it's gone, So, and then there's just a flat thing. So there's no sense of what was there. And there is an argument to say that some of these should be left and thought about and considered, because we need to know where our energy comes from, don't we? In the world of the Anthropocene, in the world of thinking about environmentalism, one of the things you kind of think about is how you trace, the flows of energy into everyday objects that we use, to how much energy does this create, or how much energy was expended in the making of this. So kind of to know this is really important. That's why I kind of argue that to kind of know the coal industry is fundamentally important because it allows you to appraise the oil industry in a certain funny kind of way, because it gives you this distance from, because the oil industry the oil industry is so ubiquitous, you can't see where it begins and ends. But with the coal industry, you can, and you can also see transitions. You can see the moment that coal transitioned into oil, and then that might allow you to think, as a designer, for example, about how oil might transition somewhere else eventually.
Fantastic. That's a perfect point to stop on. Thank you ever so much, Gary. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's been really good.
Well, that was too marvellous for words. Thank you to Gary for joining me on the podcast. As ever, see the episode description for links to Gary's professional and social profiles, and the book on Lund Humphrey's website, as well as a link to the project description on the Leverhulme Trust's website. Thanks to Lund Humphreys for the ebook, and please be sure to share this episode and subscribe to the podcast. And thanks for listening. Cheers.